Chidioch Tichborne received a death sentence for his role in the plot to replace Queen Elizabeth I with Mary Stuart. Queen Elizabeth I personally intervened in the method of execution for this young man. She issued strict orders to the executioner, forbidding him from letting the victim die during the hanging. This order forced the execution team to keep him conscious during the subsequent disembowelment step. The executioner tightened the rope around his neck and quickly dropped his body to the ground. They used a sharp knife to open his abdomen and pull his intestines out to burn. The condemned man was forced to see his own body destroyed until he was beheaded. This level of violence reflected the Tudor dynasty's fear of riots. Late 16th century England is often viewed as a successful era of theater and naval victories. However, the government actually operated as a strict police state. Religious conflict divided the nation, making theology a matter of national security. The state viewed Catholicism as a foreign threat rather than a private belief. Sir Francis Walsingham directed a large surveillance network. Cryptographers and informants monitored the English aristocracy for any signs of treason. The government treated practicing Catholics as agents of the Spanish Empire. Those who kept the traditional faith faced financial ruin, imprisonment, and execution. This strict environment directly affected Chidioch Tichborne. His family was part of the established elite in southern England, controlling the Tichborne Park estate in Hampshire. Their land ownership and territorial influence predated the 1215 Magna Carta by over a century. Chidioch held the responsibility of maintaining his family's long history. His ancestors survived the 1066 Norman conquest without losing their lands or status, and this continuous history gave the Tichbornes significant social influence in their region. As the heir, his main goal was to protect his estate from the Protestant government. The family maintained a public Catholic tradition called the Tichborne Dole. According to local records, a dying Lady Mabella Tichborne asked her husband for land to feed the poor. He agreed to donate only the area she could crawl around before dying, and she managed to encircle 23 acres. Lady Mabella left a strict warning for her husband's lineage. She stated that if the family stopped this charity, the male line would end and the manor would fall. Consequently, the Tichbornes distributed flour to the local poor every March 25th, a date that aligned directly with the Catholic feast of the Annunciation. This annual distribution secured the loyalty of the common people in Hampshire. The family openly defied Protestant laws by keeping this visible Catholic tradition, and their continued charity and influence made them a significant political obstacle for the Anglican government in London. While older texts often cite 1558 as his birth year, modern historians point to parish records showing his parents married in August 1562, suggesting he was born later. He was approximately 23 years old at the time of his execution. Growing up entirely under state persecution, he had no memory of a Catholic England. Modern educational materials have frequently misidentified him as Charles Tichborne. This specific distortion originated from a typographical error in an AQA GCSE English literature syllabus and spread rapidly through modern academic databases. His given name was exclusively Chidioch, pronounced Chidioch, explicitly chosen to honor his father's powerful political patron. Lord Chidioch Paulet was a high-ranking official who provided brief political cover for the family. Chidioch was raised in a household defined by legal expertise, intense religious fervor, and continuous financial anxiety. His father, Peter Tichborne, operated as a skilled legal clerk who had notably served the defense during the famous 1554 trial of Sir Nicholas Throckmorton. There, he absorbed the intricate, lethal mechanics of state treason trials. Peter was a younger son belonging to a marginalized branch of the powerful Tichborne family, required to leverage his intellect to secure survival. His uncompromising Catholicism, however, rendered him an immediate target of the state. The Elizabethan government utilized economic warfare to destroy the Catholic gentry through the enforcement of recusancy fines. Refusal to attend the state-mandated Anglican church services resulted in massive financial penalties designed to ruthlessly drain the liquid capital of the ancient nobility. Peter Tichborne eventually could no longer afford to pay the crown's ruinous religious fines and was subjected to years of punitive imprisonment. Chidiock grew up observing the systematic financial and physical degradation of his father at the hands of the state. He was surrounded by a tight-knit family unit, including at least 6 sisters, the most notable being Dorothy, Mary, and the youngest, affectionately recorded in family correspondence as Bab. The psychological environment of his youth was one of perpetual siege, watching the ancestral wealth bleed out to satisfy the bureaucratic demands of a government that criminalized their existence. The psychological anchor of Chidiock's brief, turbulent adult life was his marriage to Agnes Hubert, who hailed from a prominent Catholic family. The internal documentation and his private correspondence reveal a distinct, intimate dynamic that was uncharacteristic of arranged Tudor alliances. In his deepest moments of despair, and in his final letters written from the Tower of London, he addressed her with profound religious piety. Their relationship was built not just on an aristocratic alliance, but on a shared ideological resistance to the Protestant state. By the summer of 1586, the intelligence net of the Elizabethan government began to close permanently around the underground Catholic network. Agnes was either heavily pregnant or actively nursing their newborn child. The state apparatus was preparing to annihilate a young family unit, setting the stage for an act of total desperation. The structural turning point for English Catholics occurred in 1570, serving as the catalyst for the radicalization of the Tichborne generation. Operating from Rome, Pope Pius V issued a papal bull titled Regnans in Excelsis. This document was not merely a theological decree. It operated as an unyielding, formal declaration of international political war against the Tudor state. The papal bull officially excommunicated Queen Elizabeth I, explicitly branding her a heretic and an illegitimate usurper. The Pope declared she possessed no divine or legal authority to govern the English realm. Crucially, the document contained a strategically devastating political directive. It formally absolved all English subjects of their oaths of allegiance to the Queen, commanding them, under threat of their own excommunication, to disobey her laws and her administration. Overnight, the Elizabethan government weaponized this decree to fundamentally alter the legal parameters of the English state. Prior to 1570, the government had largely tolerated church papists, Catholics, who outwardly conformed to the state by attending Anglican services while privately maintaining their traditional beliefs. Regnans in Excelsis permanently destroyed this middle ground. Being a practicing Catholic in England was no longer classified as a matter of private conscience. It was legally and administratively defined as a matter of supreme national security. The Pope had ordered the overthrow of the Queen, and the state logic dictated that every Catholic who recognized the Pope's spiritual authority was inherently bound to his political directives. Every Catholic citizen was suddenly reclassified by the intelligence network. From the highest duke to the lowest laborer, they became potential sleeper agents acting on behalf of Rome and the Spanish Empire. Having established the ideological justification, the state deployed its most effective weapon against the Catholic gentry: economic attrition. The government recognized that executing thousands of Catholic landowners would trigger a massive domestic rebellion. Instead, they opted for a systematic bureaucratic process of financial ruin. By 1581, the Parliament passed the Act Against Reconciliation to Rome, legislation that weaponized church attendance. Any individual over the age of 16 who refused to attend the state-mandated Anglican church services was legally classified as a recusant. The financial penalty for recusancy was pushed to an astronomical figure, £20 per month. The devastating impact of this fine becomes absolute when placed directly within the context of 16th century economics. £20 a month equated to £240 a year. During this era, a skilled laborer might earn £5 in an entire year, while a minor gentleman or a rural landowner often possessed a total annual income of barely £100 to £300. The fine was not designed to be a punitive tax. It was a mathematically calculated instrument of bankruptcy. Families like the Tichbornes could not produce the liquid capital to pay these impossible fines. Consequently, the Exchequer invoked a brutal administrative protocol known as sequestration. State commissioners were authorized to physically seize all movable goods, including livestock, furniture, silver, and agricultural equipment. They legally confiscated the profits of 2/3 of the ancestral lands, installing loyalist administrators to bleed the estates dry. As a result, Chidioch Tichborne came of age in an era where his ancient family was left to survive on a fractured fraction of their historical wealth. The economic vice was accompanied by a total blockade of social and political advancement. The Elizabethan state moved to sterilize the future of the Catholic youth by rigorously enforcing the Act of Supremacy. They established an ideological checkpoint at the entry of every major institution in the realm. Young men were legally required to publicly swear the oath of supremacy to matriculate at Oxford or Cambridge, enter the Inns of Court to study law, secure a commission in the military, or hold any level of public office. The oath officially recognized Queen Elizabeth I as the supreme governor of the Church of England. For a young, intelligent Catholic aristocrat like Chidiock Tichborne, the message was absolute. He had no future within his own country. He was legally barred from the universities where his intellect could have been honed, barred from the legal profession that had sustained his father, and barred from the royal court, the absolute center of power and patronage. He became a second-class citizen on his own ancestral soil. The state politically sterilized his future and economically marginalized his family, forcing him into internal exile. The government stripped him of all legitimate avenues for ambition, leaving behind a volatile vacuum of disenfranchisement and resentment. This inescapable state pressure catalyzed a severe generational divide within the English Catholic community. The older generation, exemplified by Chidioch's father, Peter Tichborne, had experienced the religious swings of the preceding decades. They generally chose the path of passive endurance and strategic compliance. They paid the fines when they possessed the capital and utilized legal loopholes when possible. They rotted silently in the damp cells of the Fleet or the clink prisons when they could not pay. Their primary objective was simply to survive the reign of Elizabeth, praying that her eventual successor would restore their civil rights. The youth of Chidioch's generation possessed an entirely different psychological framework. They were born into a world where their faith was already criminalized. They watched their fathers continuously humiliated and financially broken by Protestant magistrates, who often possessed a fraction of their ancestral pedigree. This younger demographic of educated, disenfranchised aristocratic males refused to quietly wither away in rural obscurity. The passive suffering of their fathers disgusted them, viewed merely as weakness and complicity. Deprived of standard political outlets, their ambition curdled into a militant ideological fury. They were primed for radicalization, desperately seeking a catalyst to transform their political despair into physical action. That catalyst arrived in December 1581, orchestrated by the state's own machinery of terror. Sir Francis Walsingham's intelligence network successfully hunted down and captured Edmund Campion, a brilliant Jesuit priest who had covertly infiltrated England to minister to the underground Catholic network. The state subjected Campion to severe torture on the rack in the Tower of London. They convicted him of fabricated treason charges, dragged him to Tyburn, and subjected him to the ultimate penalty: hanging, drawing, and quartering. The Elizabethan government intended the public butchery of Edmund Campion to serve as an absolute deterrent. They believed the violence of the execution would permanently terrify the Catholic population into submission, but it proved to be a massive psychological miscalculation. Witnessing the state tear apart, a brilliant scholar did not terrify the Catholic youth of London and Hampshire, it galvanized them. The brutality of the execution validated their deepest hatred of the regime, transforming Campion from a hunted fugitive into an invincible martyr. The execution instilled a dangerous martyr complex in young men like Chidiock Tichborne, who absorbed the narrative that to die for the ancient faith was not a defeat, but rather the ultimate political victory against a corrupt state. The theoretical radicalization of Chidioch Tichborne transitioned into an immediate physical crisis when the state's gaze fell directly upon his family. By 1583, the Tichbornes were no longer merely facing general economic oppression. They were subjected to direct state harassment. Chidiock and his father, Peter, were formally arrested and subjected to severe interrogations by the Queen's commissioners. The official charge leveled against them was the possession of popish relics. In the regulated Elizabethan surveillance state, traveling abroad without explicit government permission was a criminal offense, often associated with espionage or receiving training at foreign Catholic seminaries. The Crown's intelligence apparatus discovered that the Tichbornes had recently traveled abroad without authorization, smuggling illicit religious items back into Hampshire. These relics typically included rosaries, Agnus Dei medallions, consecrated crosses, and papal medals. Possessing these items might seem trivial. Under the draconian statutes of the 1580s, however, importing Catholic articles blessed by the Pope was legally classified as an act of treason. It carried the penalty of praemunire, which dictated the total forfeiture of all property and perpetual imprisonment. The 1583 arrest and the subsequent interrogations marked a critical psychological threshold for Chidiock. He was forced to sit in interrogation rooms, facing the very bureaucrats who were systematically destroying his family's legacy, knowing that a single misspoken word could result in his father's permanent incarceration or execution. The continuous harassment persisted relentlessly, and by the summer of 1586, the Crown escalated its offensive, leveling dangerous accusations of popish practices directly against the Tichborne estate. The Elizabethan state had successfully executed its strategic objective. They had taken a young aristocrat and systematically stripped away his wealth, his educational prospects, and his civil rights. Chidioch Tichborne was pushed into a state of total political and economic despair. He was a man completely backed into a corner. The heavy machinery of the state was closing in on his family, and he seemingly had nothing left to lose. It was precisely within this crucible of manufactured desperation that the intelligence network's creation presented him with an alternative. The conduit for Chidiock's radicalization was his close personal friend, Anthony Babington. Babington represented the exact opposite of Chidiock's current state of decay. At 24 years old, he was a wealthy, persuasive, and intensely ambitious Catholic nobleman from Derbyshire. Babington possessed a magnetic personality that naturally drew the disenfranchised Catholic youth of London into his orbit. He maintained a refined aesthetic literacy and operated enveloped in a romanticized aura of invincibility. Unlike the impoverished Tichbornes, Babington maintained vast financial resources, allowing him to navigate the underground Catholic networks, while simultaneously presenting the outward appearance of a loyal, high-status courtier in London. For Chidiock, trapped in the crushing vice of state persecution, Anthony Babington represented an idealized vision of Catholic defiance. Babington utilized this profound psychological leverage, capitalizing on their deep personal friendship to draw Chidiock into a conspiracy that would ultimately destroy them both. Anthony Babington gave his name to the most famous conspiracy of the Elizabethan era, but he was not the original architect of the plot. He operated as the visible frontman for a deeper geopolitical operation initially masterminded by two hardened radical operatives, John Ballard and John Savage. John Ballard was a Jesuit-trained Catholic priest who operated deep underground under the alias Captain Fortescue. Ballard had traveled extensively across the European continent, meeting with high-ranking officials in the papacy, the Spanish Empire, and the Catholic League in France. He returned to England carrying explicit directives. The English Catholic community was to prepare for an immediate foreign invasion. John Savage, a veteran of the brutal religious wars in the Spanish Netherlands, was an ideologically consumed fanatic. Believing the act was divinely sanctioned by the papal bull Regnans in Excelsis, he had sworn a solemn oath to personally assassinate Queen Elizabeth I. Ballard and Savage devised a straightforward, four-step plan to overthrow the English government. First, they would assassinate Queen Elizabeth I and break Mary, Queen of Scots, out of prison. Next, Allied French and Spanish military forces would invade the coast to defeat the Protestant leaders. Finally, they would crown Mary as the new queen, officially returning England to the Catholic faith. The two men knew they could not carry out the assassination themselves. A wanted priest and a rogue soldier could never bypass the queen's strict security measures. They needed insiders with natural access to the royal palaces to get close to Elizabeth. Therefore, they began recruiting wealthy, respected noblemen who could approach the queen without raising suspicion. Anthony Babington utilized his vast social network to construct an elite inner circle known as the Six Gentlemen. This was the designated assassination squad, tasked with the intimate work of approaching Queen Elizabeth I during a public procession or in her private gardens to draw their concealed daggers and drive the blades into the sovereign. Babington recruited his closest confidants into this lethal vanguard, heavily pressuring Chidioch Tichborne to join the Six Gentlemen. The psychological mechanics of this recruitment are crucial to analyzing Chidioch's subsequent downfall. Historical interrogation records preserved within the state archives reveal a deeply conflicted Chidioch Tichborne. He did not seamlessly transition into a radical killer. When presented with the operational blueprint of the assassination, Chidioch repeatedly questioned Anthony Babington regarding the moral and theological justification of the act. Despite the papal excommunication, Chidioch harbored severe reservations about the ethical validity of murdering a sovereign monarch in cold blood, paralyzed by the profound theological implications of committing regicide. He did not join the conspiracy out of a lust for power, nor was he driven by a blinding desire for regime change. As he would later explicitly confess on the scaffold, he agreed to participate in the plot not for his own benefit, but for friendship. This admission forms the tragic core of Chidioch Tichborne's existence. He was an intelligent aristocrat who allowed blind, unconditional loyalty to a charismatic peer to override his own moral compass. The pressurized ecosystem of the underground Catholic youth elevated loyalty to one's brothers in faith above all other rational considerations, creating a fatal peer pressure. Chidioch simply could not bear to abandon his closest friend to a lethal endeavor, choosing to forfeit his life rather than break the bonds of his fraternity. The staggering absurdity of the Babington Plot and the amateurish nature of the conspirators are perfectly highlighted by the physical reality of Chidioch Tichborne himself. Historical records document that Chidioch had sustained a severe, debilitating physical injury to his leg prior to the formation of the plot. He was partially disabled and walked with a pronounced, visible limp. Assigning a physically disabled man to an elite, close-quarters assassination squad reveals a harsh truth. The conspiracy entirely lacked fundamental military logic. An assassination of a heavily guarded sovereign would require extreme physical speed and athletic agility to bypass the Queen's guard, as well as the capability to execute a rapid evasion from the immediate vicinity. Babington and his associates placed a man who could not run into the vanguard of the strike force, demonstrating they were not hardened intelligence operatives. They were angry, alienated young aristocrats playing a sophisticated game of international espionage that they fundamentally did not understand. Operating on chivalric ideals of martyrdom and glory, they were oblivious to the cold, mechanical reality of treason. The conspirators operated under the illusion of complete secrecy, entirely unaware that they were walking directly into a flawless, orchestrated masterclass in counterintelligence. Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's principal secretary, was the supreme architect of the Tudor surveillance state. He was aware of the conspiracy almost from the exact moment of its inception, as his sprawling, meticulously compartmentalized network of double agents and paid informants had deeply penetrated the Catholic underground. Walsingham did not immediately dispatch the state militia to arrest Babington, Tichborne, and the 6 gentlemen, knowing that arresting a group of radicalized youths would merely suppress a localized threat. Walsingham harbored a significantly broader, calculated geopolitical objective. He intended to utilize the conspirators as disposable bait to capture the ultimate prize, the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, had been held under secure house arrest in England for nearly 2 decades. As a Catholic with a legitimate blood claim to the English throne, she served as the living figurehead for every Catholic rebellion and Spanish invasion plot against Elizabeth. Walsingham recognized that as long as Mary continued to draw breath, the Tudor state would never be secure. Queen Elizabeth I absolutely refused to sign a death warrant for her royal cousin without direct, undeniable proof, requiring heavy documentation that Mary had personally and explicitly endorsed her assassination. Walsingham's supreme objective was to manufacture a controlled environment that would allow the Babington conspirators to directly communicate with Mary, intending to manipulate the captive queen into committing her treason to paper. To execute this intelligence operation, Walsingham relocated Mary, Queen of Scots, to Chartley Castle in Staffordshire, a heavily fortified manor managed by a strict Puritan jailer, Sir Amias Paulet. Paulet immediately severed all of Mary's known communication lines, isolating her completely from the outside world. This calculated isolation created a desperate psychological vacuum, priming Mary to accept any new channel of communication offered to her. Walsingham then deployed his primary asset, Gilbert Giffard, a brilliant Catholic double agent. Giffard approached the French embassy and the underground Catholic network, offering to establish a secure, clandestine communication conduit directly into Chartley Castle. The mechanism Giffard utilized was a masterpiece of analog espionage. Chartley Castle required massive quantities of beer to supply the household and the guards, with a local brewer in the nearby town of Burton supplying the kegs. Giffard engineered a system for treasonous encrypted letters written by Babington and the Catholic operatives. The letters were tightly rolled and sealed in waterproof leather tubes, physically slipped through the small wooden bunghole of the beer kegs before delivery to the castle. Mary's loyal servants inside Chartley would drain the beer, extract the hidden tubes, and deliver the encrypted intelligence directly to the captive queen. The conspirators and Mary, Queen of Scots, believed they were operating a completely secure communication network. They were entirely unaware that every single barrel of beer was being quietly intercepted by the Tudor state before it reached its destination. Walsingham assembled an elite, meticulously trained intelligence apparatus operating in absolute secrecy to process the intercepted communications. When a leather tube was extracted from a keg, it was immediately handed to Arthur Gregory. Gregory was a supreme technical specialist and a master in the art of physical tampering, deploying custom-forged heated knives and specific chemical compounds to meticulously slice away the heavy wax seals of the letters without fracturing the intricate family crests pressed into the wax. Once the seal was bypassed, the document was passed to the most lethal intellectual weapon in Walsingham's arsenal, Thomas Phillips. Phillips was a genius cryptanalyst and a mathematical prodigy who possessed a highly acute capability for pattern recognition. Mary, Queen of Scots, operated through a mathematically dense cipher system involving substitute symbols, null characters, and specialized nomenclature to mask her communications. Operating without computers, Phillips utilized the raw processing power of his intellect and the mathematical principles of frequency analysis to systematically crack the royal cipher. He translated the intercepted letters and hand-copied the contents for Walsingham's intelligence dossiers before returning the original document to Arthur Gregory. Gregory flawlessly resealed the wax, leaving absolutely no physical trace of the breach. The letter was placed back into the beer keg and allowed to proceed to its target, providing the state with a direct, real-time wiretap on the internal communications of the conspiracy. The intelligence operation reached its climax in July 1586. Operating under the illusion of secrecy, Anthony Babington drafted a detailed letter directly to Mary, Queen of Scots. In this document, Babington explicitly outlined the entire geopolitical conspiracy, detailing the foreign invasion plans and specifically mentioning the 6 gentlemen appointed to execute the execution of Queen Elizabeth. On July 17, 1586, Mary, Queen of Scots, finally took the bait. Desperate for liberation and believing the communication was secure, she drafted a detailed response. In her encrypted letter, Mary explicitly approved the operation, offering tactical advice on how to manage the foreign troops and coordinate the assassination. The letter was intercepted and placed on the desk of Thomas Phillips. The cryptanalyst cracked the cipher and realized the magnitude of the document. He had finally secured the undeniable proof of high treason required to execute a sovereign queen. In a moment of supreme triumph, Phillips picked up his quill, drew a small, detailed sketch of a gallows directly on the parchment, and handed the translated document to Sir Francis Walsingham. The trap had successfully snapped shut, and Mary, Queen of Scots, had legally signed her own death warrant. Walsingham, however, required one final piece of intelligence to guarantee the absolute destruction of the domestic conspiracy. He needed the specific identities of the elite strike force. Walsingham ordered Thomas Phillips to execute an act of proactive forgery. Utilizing his mastery of Mary's cipher system, Phillips forged a convincing postscript at the bottom of Mary's letter, sealing it and sending it to Babington. The forged postscript directly requested that Babington supply the specific names of the 6 gentlemen assigned to the assassination. The Tudor intelligence state had manipulated the conspirators into providing the exact legal evidence required to annihilate them. The illusion of the Catholic rebellion was shattered, and the brutal physical reality of the state's retaliation was about to begin. Chidioch Tichborne was standing directly in the crosshairs. On August 4, 1586, the Elizabethan state executed its first overt maneuver. The government did not immediately sweep up the aristocratic conspirators. Instead, they initiated the collapse of the network by targeting its ideological architect. John Ballard, the underground Jesuit priest who had originally masterminded the geopolitical framework of the plot, was abruptly arrested by state agents. The arrest of Ballard triggered a massive panic within the upper echelons of the conspiracy. Anthony Babington was sitting in a London tavern when he received the intelligence of Ballard's capture, simultaneously recognizing that he was under conspicuous physical surveillance by Walsingham's operatives. Babington recognized that his operational cover was completely blown and his arrest was imminent. In a moment of sheer terror, he abruptly abandoned the tavern, leaving his expensive cloak and sword behind to avoid arousing the suspicion of the agents shadowing him. Fleeing into the narrow streets of London, he frantically attempted to mobilize his co-conspirators, including Chidioch Tichborne, to execute an immediate evacuation from the capital. The conspirators were not hardened, combat-trained operatives. They were privileged aristocrats who had never operated outside the secure parameters of their ancestral estates or the elite circles of London, and their subsequent attempt at survival brutally exposed their operational incompetence. Fleeing the immediate urban center, they sought refuge in the dense foliage of St. John's Wood, which at the time was a thick, overgrown forest located just outside the city limits. Recognizing that their elite aristocratic aesthetic, expensive velvet doublets, imported silks, and ostentatious lace ruffs would immediately identify them to the state militia, they desperately attempted to discard their identities. They stripped off their expensive clothing and dressed themselves in stolen peasant garments. In a fundamentally ignorant attempt to alter their physical complexions and masquerade as weather-beaten laborers, they crushed walnuts and smeared the dark, acidic juice directly onto their faces and hands to stain their skin. The absurdity of their flight was compounded by a complete lack of basic wilderness survival skills. The polished aristocrats possessed no logistical supply lines, no secure safe houses, and absolutely no knowledge of how to navigate or survive in the forest environment. Furthermore, the physical reality of Chidioch Tichborne proved to be a catastrophic logistical anchor for the entire group. Chidioch's pre-existing leg injury severely limited his mobility, causing him to walk with a pronounced limp. Evasion required extreme physical endurance and rapid movement to bypass the closing state militia, and Chidioch was entirely incapable of keeping pace. His physical disability drastically slowed the movement of the entire group, completely neutralizing any tactical advantage they might have possessed. They could not execute a rapid escape toward the heavily forested north or the coastal ports. Instead, they were physically anchored to the immediate surveilled vicinity of London. Starving, physically exhausted, and paralyzed by paranoia, the conspirators were unable to sustain their evasion in the woods. Driven by dehydration and hunger, they were forced to break cover. They crept out of St. John's Wood and attempted to seek refuge and provisions at the local estate of the Bellamy family in Harrow, a known Catholic family who had previously harbored underground priests. Walsingham had already initiated a massive, publicized manhunt, distributing physical descriptions of the conspirators to every local magistrate and militia unit in the region. When the ragged, dirt-stained aristocrats approached the Bellamy estate in mid-August, they were immediately recognized. The local militia rapidly mobilized, surrounding the property and apprehending the primary conspirators, including Babington and Tichborne, without significant resistance. The brief flight of the Catholic vanguard had ended in absolute humiliation. The captured conspirators were transported under heavy armed guard back to the capital, dragged directly into the ultimate symbol of Tudor executive power, the Tower of London. Custody of the prisoners was transferred to Sir Owen Hopton, the lieutenant of the Tower, a rigid state administrator who strictly enforced the operational parameters of the fortress. Chidioch Tichborne was subjected to extreme solitary confinement, likely incarcerated within the thick, fortified walls of the White Tower or the Beauchamp Tower. The physical conditions of his confinement were engineered to accelerate the biological and psychological collapse of the prisoner. The cells were lightless, devoid of functional ventilation, and perpetually damp. For Chidioch, this environment was physically devastating. The freezing stone walls aggressively worsened his untreated leg injury. Lacking access to medical care, clean bandages, or adequate nutrition, the physical pain intensified exponentially, rendering him vulnerable to the subsequent phases of state interrogation. The Elizabethan state heavily utilized physical torture to extract actionable intelligence and secure signed confessions required for state trials. The primary instrument of this mechanical terror was the rack, located deep within the subterranean interrogation rooms of the tower. While his accomplices, notably the lower status operatives and the priests, were subjected to the physical agony of having their joints violently dislocated and their ligaments systematically shredded by the rotating wooden cylinders, the historical record suggests that Chidioch Tichborne was spared the actual physical stretching. However, he was not spared the horror of the machine. The Tudor interrogators utilized an effective, traumatizing psychological technique known as being shown the rack. Suffering from a deteriorating leg and isolated in total darkness for days, Chidioch was marched down into the lightless, torch-lit interrogation chambers and forced to stand directly beside the blood-stained wooden rollers of the machine. The state interrogators were masters of psychological warfare. They methodically detailed the exact anatomical destruction the machine would inflict upon his crippled body if he refused to cooperate. All the while, he was forced to listen to the screams of his co-conspirators echoing through the stone corridors. Broken by the absolute isolation, the agonizing pain of his leg, and the terror of impending physical dismemberment, Chidioch's resolve collapsed. He confessed to possessing explicit knowledge of the assassination plot, clinging desperately to the legally useless defense that he had only kept quiet and participated out of deep personal friendship for Anthony Babington. The Elizabethan state did not conduct treason trials to determine guilt. They conducted them as highly publicized, carefully choreographed theaters of absolute political power. On September 13 and 14, 1586, the primary conspirators were dragged from the Tower and transported to Westminster Hall. They were placed before a special Oyer and Terminer Commission comprised of the highest-ranking nobles, judges, and intelligence officers in the realm, including Sir Francis Walsingham himself. The legal architecture of the trial was based entirely on the unyielding logic of the 1351 Treason Act. Under English common law, specifically the doctrine of misprision of treason, possessing explicit knowledge of a treasonous plot and failing to immediately report it to the state authorities was legally classified as treason, punished in the exact same manner as physically committing the act of high treason itself. The procedural dynamics of the trial were asymmetric. The defendants were explicitly denied the right to legal counsel, were not permitted to view the evidence against them prior to the trial, and were forbidden from calling witnesses to testify on their behalf. The burden of defense rested entirely on men who were physically broken, sleep-deprived, and psychologically shattered by weeks of confinement. While several of his co-conspirators attempted to mount convoluted legal defenses, arguing technicalities regarding their exact level of involvement, Chidioch Tichborne recognized the absolute futility of the proceedings. When called before the tribunal, Chidioch stood and immediately entered a formal plea of guilty. He did not attempt to obfuscate his involvement or deny his knowledge of the operation. Instead, he utilized his moment before the court to deliver a bitter public speech. He explicitly and publicly cursed Anthony Babington for utilizing their deep personal friendship to drag him into a geopolitical nightmare. Articulating the profound tragedy of his radicalization, he publicly acknowledged that his loyalty to a peer had overridden his moral compass and destroyed his ancient family name. Chidioch knew without a shadow of a doubt that he was a dead man, as the mandatory sentence for high treason was hanging, drawing, and quartering. He asked for the swift stroke of an axe to the neck rather than the agonizing butchery of the butcher's block. However, historical records indicate that Queen Elizabeth I, determined to send a terrifying message, explicitly denied the request. With the guilty verdict formally entered into the judicial record, the state activated the most devastating bureaucratic weapon in the English legal arsenal, the Act of Attainder. Attainder, legally referred to as the corruption of blood, was not merely a death sentence for the individual. It was an administrative death sentence for the entire lineage. By declaring Chidioch Tichborne attainted, the state legally declared his biological bloodline to be permanently tainted, impure, and fundamentally severed from the protection of English law. The immediate economic consequences were absolute. The massive Tichborne lands in Hampshire, held by the family since the 12th century, were immediately and permanently confiscated by the Crown. All liquid capital, property, and physical assets were seized. More devastatingly, the corruption of blood explicitly stripped his unborn child of all inheritance rights and legal status, leaving his wife, Agnes, completely destitute. The state denied her even the most basic widow's pension, ensuring that the remnants of the Tichborne family were cast into abject poverty. The Tudor legal machinery had achieved its ultimate goal. Not only did they physically obliterate the conspirator, but they also legally, economically, and biologically erased his family from the architecture of the English elite. The state apparatus had concluded its work, scheduling the physical destruction of Chidioch Tichborne for the following week. Queen Elizabeth I was gripped by justified political paranoia. The revelation that the primary assassins were wealthy, educated courtiers terrified the monarch, as these men possessed the access to regularly walk the halls of her own palaces. Moreover, the geopolitical threat of the Spanish Armada was preparing to launch a massive invasion force against the English coast. Consequently, Elizabeth demanded a public theater of absolute terror. Normally, when executing aristocrats by the method of hanging, drawing, and quartering, the state executioner would employ an unofficial practice known as the secret grace. The executioner would allow the condemned to hang from the noose until they were completely biologically dead, or at least in a state of irreversible unconsciousness, before initiating the physical dismemberment. However, Queen Elizabeth I explicitly forbade this practice for the entire first group of conspirators. Operating under direct royal mandate, she issued written executive orders dictating that the executioner must cut the rope early, ensuring the condemned men were kept entirely conscious and aware as their anatomy was surgically dismantled by the state. On September 20, 1586, the state executed the physical phase of its retaliation. The government did not utilize the standard execution grounds at Tyburn. Instead, a massive, custom-built scaffold was erected in St. Giles in the Fields, the exact London neighborhood where the conspirators had held their clandestine meetings to plot the assassination. The wooden platform was elevated 2 to 3 meters high, ensuring that the tens of thousands of attending spectators possessed an unobstructed view of the anatomical destruction. Chidioch Tichborne was designated as the 4th or 5th man to be led to the scaffold that morning. This specific sequencing was a calculated instrument of psychological torture. He was forced to stand at the base of the wooden platform for hours, listening to the screams and physically watching the blood of his closest friends, John Ballard, Anthony Babington, and John Savage, rained down through the wooden floorboards as they were butchered alive directly above him. When Chidioch's execution commenced, the violence applied to his body was systematic and clinically precise. He was strapped flat to a woven wooden hurdle and dragged by a horse for 5 kilometers from the fortified gates of the Tower of London to St. Giles, relentlessly pulled over jagged cobblestones, deep mud, and horse manure. His back and head sustained severe bleeding lacerations long before he reached the execution stairs. He was positioned on the trapdoor with a thick hemp slip knot secured around his neck. The state utilized a short drop, a fall of less than 1 meter, deliberately calculated to prevent the kinetic force from snapping the cervical vertebrae. For 10 agonizing seconds, the rope crushed his trachea, restricting oxygen and turning his face dark purple as he suffocated. The executioner then severed the rope, sending Chidioch crashing to the heavy wooden platform. The sudden release of pressure allowed his lungs to gasp for fresh oxygen, flooding his central nervous system with adrenaline. As 3 state assistants pinned his naked body to the block, the executioner began his grim work. Because the major descending arteries in his back remained untouched, Chidioch's cardiovascular system continued pumping oxygenated blood to his brain. He was forced to endure the ultimate physical degradation mandated by law, kept fully conscious and neurologically aware as he watched his own organs extracted and burned beside him. Clinical biological death only arrived during the final mercy of beheading. The state apparatus proceeded with the post-mortem mutilation, aiming to prevent the organic remains from decomposing too rapidly while on public display. Chidioch's severed head and the four-hacked quarters of his dismembered torso were thrown into massive cauldrons filled with boiling brine, laced with cumin seeds, a chemical additive utilized to mask the necrotic stench and deter scavenging birds. The boiled flesh was then plunged into vats of boiling pitch, creating a hard, black, weather-resistant shell around the tissue. His head was spiked on the heavily fortified gatehouse of London Bridge. His preserved limbs were shipped off to be bolted to the iron gates of Aldgate and Ludgate, and the final quarters were dispatched back to his ancestral home in Hampshire, serving as a visible warning to his surviving family. The unrestrained severity of the September 20th executions triggered an immediate public backlash. The London crowd was highly accustomed to public violence, but in this instance, they turned actively hostile, deeply disgusted, and politically alienated by the protracted, surgical torture of young, prominent aristocrats. Recognizing that the state had pushed the public tolerance for violence too far, Queen Elizabeth I executed a rapid administrative pivot. She issued revised orders to the Lieutenant of the Tower for the remaining 7 conspirators, scheduled for execution the following day. The executioner was explicitly ordered to apply the secret grace, allowing the men to hang from the noose until they were biologically dead before the blades were drawn for the dismemberment. The blood on the scaffold at St. Giles does not define the historical legacy of Chidioch Tichborne. His historical significance stems from his actions in the silence of the night preceding his execution. On September 19, locked in his freezing cell within the Tower of London and possessing absolute knowledge of the precise anatomical horrors awaiting him at dawn, Chidioch drafted a final farewell letter to his wife, Agnes. Enclosed within that state-intercepted letter was a poem consisting of 3 stanzas, containing 6 lines each, known globally today as Tichborne's elegy. Linguistically, the poem represents a disciplined intellectual achievement. Written in strict iambic pentameter, the architectural constraint of the poem is absolute. Almost every single word utilized in the text is a monosyllable, with the sole historical exception being the word fallen, originally printed as the contraction fallen. By deliberately forcing the reader to vocalize 10 distinct single-syllable words per line, Tichborne engineered a stark, unyielding rhythmic structure. The auditory effect perfectly mimics the relentless, inescapable mechanical ticking of a clock, directly mirroring the countdown of the final hours of his biological life. He deployed the core Renaissance literary techniques of antithesis and paradox, systematically placing the bright, optimistic expectations of his youth against the grim, inescapable legal reality of his impending execution. Every single stanza concludes with an identical refrain that rings out like a mechanical funeral bell. And now I live, and now my life is done. The state archives and the Edinburgh Library manuscripts contain other poetic fragments authored by Tichborne during this period. To his friend is a poem depicting 2 men sailing directly into a storm, hopelessly trapped between the mythological hazards of Scylla and Charybdis. Another surviving piece, The House Dove, operates as a political metaphor where Chidioch casts himself as a naive, harmless dove swept up in a flock of aggressive crows, ultimately netted by a crafty fowler, a direct jab at Sir Francis Walsingham, and executed entirely for the company he kept. In a cynical tactical maneuver, the Elizabethan state attempted to weaponize Tichborne's poetry. Less than 1 month after executing him, the government ordered the licensed state printer, John Wolfe, to publish Tichborne's elegy, embedded within a propaganda pamphlet titled Verses of Praise and Joy. The intelligence apparatus calculated that broadcasting Chidioch's utter psychological despair would demoralize the remaining Catholic underground. To ensure the political messaging was unambiguous, the government hired a prominent playwright, widely identified by historians as Thomas Kede, the author of the Spanish tragedy. Kede drafted a mocking, state-sponsored rebuttal printed directly beside Chidioch's final words titled Hendecasyllabon TK. Kede deliberately mimicked Tichborne's exact rhythmic structure to taunt the dead man, deploying lines such as, "Thy prime of youth is frozen with thy faults," emphatically declaring to the public that the traitor deserved his anatomical end. The propaganda offensive was an unmitigated disaster for the crown. The English public ignored Kede's state-sponsored hatred. Instead, they read Chidioch's raw words and wept. The human tragedy, the disciplined confrontation of mortality, and the vulnerability of a 23-year-old aristocrat facing absolute destruction resonated instantaneously across the political divide. The elegy bypassed the state censors, spreading like wildfire as it was illicitly copied by hand and circulated covertly through the courts of Europe. Chidioch Tichborne completely failed to execute any of his political ambitions. He was a disastrous liability as an assassin and the ultimate victim of his own misplaced loyalty. The Elizabethan state utilized the full weight of its legal and physical power against him, fully intending to erase his existence from the historical record through physical dismemberment and the legal mechanism of attainder. However, the poem he wrote in the hours before his death bypassed the state apparatus. Tichborne's elegy spread rapidly across the European continent, surviving as a permanent historical record of the era's brutality. The most prominent Tudor composers subsequently set his words to music, securing his name in history and fundamentally defeating the Elizabethan state's effort to permanently silence him.